大哥，你吃饭了吗？
我还没吃饭，我的肚子好饿。
为什么你还没吃饭？
因为我需要学习中文。
你是怎么学习？是用哪个方法？
每天我看这本书2个小时，上课1个小时，还用这些 flashcards。
大哥，不对，你这样不行。
怎么了？
我发现了更好的方法，就是你使用它，学会中文会更容易。
你的方法是什么？
我看电影，我看书，没有课，没有老师。
真的吗？你成功了，学会中文吗？
当然，这个方法叫 input-based learning。
好吧，告诉我中文的东西。
怎么回事？
是怎么回事？
怎么回事？怎么回事？
这到底怎么回事？
快点走！快！
你快点走！
快！
快点！
拜托，快走！
发现目标，开火！
发现目标。
没有。
长官，发现目标！
开火！开火！
原力会与你同在。
原力会与你同在。原力会与你同在。
原力会与你同在。
你好像只学了电影里的东西，没什么用。
我不同意，非常有用。我学会很多词，我了解很多事，最重要的是很好玩。
好吧，让我试试。
Okay, that was hard, but I wanted to pull up and show you where my Chinese is after about a year of learning. I actually had to sit down and write it out word for word. And also, by the way, I'm benefiting from the ability to edit this video, so my Chinese would definitely be way worse if we were just having a live back and forth conversation. And I'm sure that there are some parts of this that don't sound super natural in terms of the word choice or the grammar. Actually, you know what, for this, let's go check ChatGPT and see what they have to say.
What you actually saw was a version that already had some corrections by ChatGPT, so this is the raw, error-prone version of it. Hi, I wrote the below in Mandarin. So 3 major errors, which I'm not surprised by. And then it gives me a bunch of more optional changes for how to phrase things a little more naturally. And its assessment, overall, your Mandarin conversation captures the essence well and has good structure. The corrections mainly focus on making the language flow more naturally and aligned with typical conversational usage. When I look back at that clip and I think about my journey here, I am actually really happy with the results so far. So what is the method that I'm using? Well, as I just said in my little Chinese monologue, I'm using a method that some people call input-based learning. And that is just a fancy way to say that I am largely learning Chinese by consuming content in the language, whether that is TV shows, movies, or books. And then the other big part of my approach is that I am using some of the new technology that's out there to really accelerate my progress. You know, there are some things that are like still pretty basic, such as using digital flashcards through an iPhone app. But then I've also been getting into some of the more advanced stuff, the ChatGPT that you just saw, or things like using AI tools and programs that I'm writing myself to generate transcripts of things that I'm watching. So in this video, first I will share my general approach to learning Chinese, and then I will deep dive into a few areas such as how I am using media to learn, so again, movies, TV shows, books, how I am learning my vocabulary, how I'm tracking my progress, and as part of that, you'll see exactly where my progress is now on certain things such as like how many words I know. And then finally, I will go into a very little bit about what I've been starting to do in terms of practicing producing Chinese, whether that's again by writing or speaking. This is a longer and more in-depth video, and so feel free to use the timestamps to skip around. With that, let's dive right in. All right, so what is my overall approach? The idea is that instead of focusing on going to class or drilling grammar, you instead focus on getting what they call comprehensible input. And comprehensible input simply just means messages in the foreign language that you can actually understand. It's not necessary to understand every single part of the message, but you need to at least be understanding some parts of what you are listening to or reading. And then once you start understanding some parts, you can then use that to start understanding the parts that you don't understand. And the idea is that kind of snowballs on and on until you understand everything. Now, according to this theory or idea,
Actually, the majority of the time that you are spending studying a language should be focused on getting comprehensible input. And after hundreds and hundreds of hours, you'll start to understand the meaning of different words and context. And it's basically the best thing you can do to get to anywhere near something like native level fluency. Because it's really meant to mimic how you learned your first language as a child. You didn't sit in a classroom learning grammar drills for your first language, but rather you just kind of absorbed it by listening to people around you and slowly figuring out what it is that they were saying. Now, there is a debate about whether adults can actually learn languages in the same way that kids can. And I don't really know the answer, and I don't know if anyone really knows the answer, but this method at least assumes that there's enough in your brain that is the same as a kid, that if you start to mimic the approach that kids take to learn a language, that you'll get, good results as well. So how do you get this comprehensible input? Well, it's pretty simple. It's basically just reading, watching TV, watching movies, listening to things like podcasts. You're basically just going to consume media in that language. And one unique thing about this approach is that you actually don't focus on trying to speak very much at the beginning. You may hear of this being referred to as output, speaking as output, ingesting media as input. Instead, you are really focusing on getting that input, learning vocab, learning what things mean in context, and then only after you have developed a really good ability to understand the things that you're hearing and reading, that's when you really move the focus to output and actually trying to speak more. So reading, listening, watching, that's the main focus. But you also do supplement it with other stuff to help in that process. Most people out there recommend that you do some form of vocabulary study, some form of learning about, the basic grammar of the language. It's like you don't have to fully do it the same way that a kid does it. You can take advantage of the fact that you're an adult and you can kind of speed up the process by doing some of these other supplemental things. But the main focus is still on input. So it's not really proven how well this works, but what I do know is that I've heard of many examples of people who have applied this method and they seem to have gotten really, really good in the language. And to me, it kind of makes logical sense that in order to really understand a language well, you have to consume a lot of it. Otherwise, how do you get the knowledge of what that language is supposed to be like? And I do also know that a lot of people take the more classroom-based approach. And yes, that can work too for a lot of people. But for a lot of people, that just doesn't work very well. I'm sure you've heard the classic example of the person who has like a major in French in college, but they still can't even have a conversation in French. So the idea has intrigued me enough that I'm like, okay, let me give it a try. So the other thing is, what are the downsides of this method? Well, there are at least two that I can think of. The first is that it can take a really long time. Most estimates out there say that you need, hundreds and hundreds of hours of consuming stuff before you can actually learn the language. And then second, and maybe more important, is that this method inherently requires you to feel comfortable not understanding everything that you're consuming at the beginning. Because there's the whole question of how do you get started listening and reading if you don't actually know anything? And I'll address that in more detail in a little bit, but the basic truth of it is that you're not gonna be able to avoid some pain and discomfort, or however you wanna think about it, at the beginning when you are at zero and you don't know anything and you're trying very hard to understand this very complicated thing that you know nothing about. So this topic of input-based methods is a really deep one. There's a lot that people have written about it, a lot that people have made videos on, and I could probably make a whole video just about this topic. But instead of doing that, I'm just gonna leave some resources down in the description below, and I encourage you to check those out. All right, so let's talk about some of the specifics of the approach. For that, I got my trusty iPad. Now, I have basically broken down my own approach into 5 different elements. And the first element is pronunciation. The second element is vocabulary. The third element is what we just now talked about, which is input. The fourth element is grammar. And then the fifth element, which all of these are eventually leading to, is output, or actually talking. All right, now before I go into these, I want to give you an overview of a tool that kind of cuts across all of these, and that is something called SRS. SRS stands for Space Repetition System, and you can basically think about it as a way of making automated flashcards. Basically, in these programs, you can make these flashcards, and then there is an algorithm that basically tells you when you should review each flashcard. And in order for the algorithm to determine that, it takes into account how often you get things right and how often you get things wrong. And then it also takes into account how long it thinks you'll remember different things. So when you first learn a card, it'll show it to you kind of the first day, it'll show it to you the second day, and then maybe it'll show it to you like 2 days later, and then maybe 4 days later, and then a week, and then 2 weeks. And then it'll kind of just keep stretching out because the more times you repeat it, the longer you remember it, and therefore the less often it needs to show you those things. And the idea is that this should make learning things more efficient because the program is only showing you the things that it thinks you need to know at a certain point. And so I've been a big user. There are a few programs out there that do this. The most popular one is called Anki, which I use as part of my whole approach, and I'll get to that in a minute. But then there's a lot of other, specific ones for specific things that you might be trying to learn. And for Chinese in particular, there's another one called Skritter, which I also use as part of my approach, and I'll talk about more in a minute. And for all of this, once again, I will put more information in the description below if you want to learn more. All right, so now on to each of the 5 parts. And the part that I actually started with, a little bit counterintuitive, was pronunciation. And the reason I say it's counterintuitive is because I just now said that with this approach, you're not really focusing on output at the beginning. You're only focusing on input. But I wanted to start learning this early, even if I'm not going to be outputting anytime soon. Because number one, in Chinese is apparently really hard, which I'll get to in a minute. And more importantly, having a good understanding of pronunciation at the beginning can really help you understand the input that you're consuming a lot more efficiently. So what makes pronunciation trickier in Chinese than some other languages? Well, it's this thing that you've probably heard of if you have learned anything about Chinese, and that is tones. And what tones are is basically that in Chinese, each word, or really each syllable, each has their own kind of pitch that you have to pronounce it at. And if you get it wrong, you may be saying a word that's different from the word that you thought you were saying. It can get really confusing for an English speaker because we don't have really a tonal language. But in Chinese, you have all these words that they have the same spelling, like they have the same vowels and consonants, but the tone is different, and then therefore the meanings of those words can be different from each other. Now, the one example that I think is really illustrative of this in Chinese is the word shi. Now, this word can have multiple meanings depending on the tone. For all the actual Chinese speakers out there, excuse me for a second because I'm going to try to go through these. And I am so early in my Chinese learning that I'm sure I'm going to get it wrong, but hopefully you'll be able to get the point. So the first tone is one that is like a high to low tone, and it's denoted by kind of this little mark here. And the tone goes high to low, and so you should say it like sh. Starts high, low, sh. And there are actually multiple words in Chinese that have this first tone. One of them is the one sh, which is, and there's another one called also sh, which is basically thing. And then there's a bunch of others that are all sh with the high to low tone. Now, the second version is sh with just a high tone. So the first one I just mentioned goes from high to low. This one is just high and it stays high. So it's like sh, it's kind of like you're singing sh, and it is denoted this way with a kind of horizontal thing over the I. And one of the words in Chinese that is this sh is the word for teacher, sh. Okay, now the third version is more of a low to high. So it's like sh. It's kind of like you're asking a question. Sh. And it is written this way in Roman letters. And then there's a bunch of words in Chinese that have this sound. Probably the most basic one is the word for 10, which is sh. And then there's another one. The word for time, which is sh. So you're starting to see that there's lots of words in Chinese that sound exactly the same as each other. Okay, and then the fourth variation, because there's 4 tones, or sometimes people will say there's 5 different tones in Chinese, but the fourth one I'll go through here is the low tone. And that's written this way with the little kind of upside down caret. And again, there's a few different words in Chinese that have this particular sound, and the way that you say this one is like a low tone, so it's like sh, it's kind of like lower. And there's, again, many words in Chinese that have this exact same sound. One of the most common ones is sh, which is one of the Chinese words for use. So now, that was a lot to go through, but the point is, in Chinese, it's a bit difficult because of these tones. At first I thought it was completely different from English because in English, you don't really have tones that work in the same way. But there are a couple of things in English that are at least somewhat similar to tones. The first example is actually pretty simple. It's asking a question. So you can think about it as like, the same sentence can either be a statement or a question depending on whether you raise the end of the sentence, whether kind of the end of the sentence has like a rising tone. And so you can say, you're going to the store, which is more of a statement. Or you can say, you're going to the store, which is more of a question. So in English, it operates a little bit at a more sentence level. And in Chinese, it operates more at a word level where it can change the meaning of individual words. But in English, you even have some things which operate more at the word level as well. One of my favorite examples is the word permit. You can kind of say this word two different ways. You can say permit, or you can say permit. And actually those mean two different things. And so what has been my approach to learning? Well, the first is that I found some pretty useful YouTube videos, which give a bit of a primer on how this all works. And I'll link some of those in the description below. And then second, this is the first place where SRS comes in. I downloaded this deck in Anki, and there's a bunch of flashcards where it's like, it plays a sound and it plays a word, and you have to say, what is the spelling out in Roman letters, including what the tone is. So again, I've been going through all of this, not really to get it perfect, not really to be able to speak very well anytime soon, but so that I can be able to understand my inputs. All right, and so then topic number 2 is vocabulary. And so really in the early stages of me learning, this is one of my first focuses. Because if you don't know any words, it's really hard to do anything else in the language. But if you do know most of the words in something that you come across, like let's say you see a sentence, you know all the words, but maybe you don't even know any of the grammar of the language, you can probably still figure out what that sentence means. And so this is really my first priority. My first goal was to reach 1,000 words in the language. And I'll get to exactly where I am on that in a little bit. But let's just say that with 1,000 words for most of the stuff that you'd be consuming, that gets you to around knowing, 50% of the words in any given text or movie or whatnot. And 50% might sound like a lot, but it's actually still really not quite enough to understand a lot of stuff. And so then what has my approach been to learning this? Well, for this, I am heavily using SRS. In particular, this program I mentioned earlier called Skritter. And Skritter lets you make these flashcards of different Chinese words. And the special thing about Skritter is that for Chinese, it allows you to make 4 different types of cards. The first type is that you try to guess the definition of a word. The second is that you try to tell what the pinyin for the word is. And pinyin is just basically the way of writing out Chinese and Roman letters. So pinyin would be things like this over here, and then these would be the actual characters. The third type of flashcard requires you to give what the tone is. So they may give you kind of pinyin without the little, tone markers that I went through. And you have to remember what the tone is. And then for the fourth type of card, you actually have to write out the character. So it'll show you what the pinyin is, and you have to say, what is the character? And it's actually this writing the character piece, which is the main reason why I'm using Skritter instead of some of the other programs out there, because Skritter actually allows you to, use a pen, or if you're on your phone, you can use your thumb or your fingers to draw out the characters. And you may ask, why am I even learning to write these characters in the first place? I think a lot of people learning Chinese would say, you don't need to learn to write them. But I decided I wanted to learn to write them just because I thought it would make it easier for me to remember them. And it was really hard at first to learn to write them, but now it actually feels not that bad. So yeah, this is a lot to learn at once because for each word, you kind of have to learn, 4 different things. You can start to appreciate why Chinese is so hard. Now, one thing you can do is you can use some tips and tricks and some mnemonic techniques to learn some of these characters. And I specifically use this one called memory palaces, which is a technique that a lot of memory champions use in competitions where they're trying to remember, a long list of items or, numbers or something like that. And I will also give you a link in the description below if you want to learn more about that approach. All right, so item number 3 is input. And as I mentioned, this is actually the main focus of this approach. So pretty much from day 1, I've been starting to find ways to consume things in Chinese. For instance, I think on even like day 2 or 3 of me learning the language, I actually opened up Netflix and started to watch some movies in Chinese. And I'll get to how you actually do that, even if you don't know any Chinese at the beginning, here in a little bit. But first I want to talk about, one of the trade-offs you have to make all throughout this journey is what kind of content you want to consume. And specifically, kind of easy content versus hard content. And there are trade-offs to both. Because like when you're first starting out, you may say that, okay, I should just focus on easier content, maybe content made for children or content made for language learners. And maybe that's where you should start. But a lot of times that content can be just not as exciting and maybe a little bit boring. On the other hand, you may say, I want to start learning hard content. I want to start watching movies and TV shows made for native speakers. And that content can be more engaging and more interesting, but it's also very hard at the beginning because you don't understand anything. Basically, I had a hard time deciding between these, and so I have been doing a little bit of both. I've been doing some easier stuff, like they make these things called graded readers, which are basically books written in simple language with limited vocabulary, made for language learners. And there's also like a couple of children's TV shows that I've been watching on YouTube. But then also I've been doing a lot of the harder stuff, and I probably actually spent more of my time on this. Because early on, I actually figured out that Disney Plus, oddly enough, has almost all of their content dubbed in Chinese and also with Chinese subtitles. The subtitles don't always match what the sound is, which is a whole other story. I can make a whole other video about how I've dealt with that. But it's great because, you know, you have sound, you have subtitles, you can hear what the language is, and then ideally you should be able to read it as well, which makes it a little bit easier to understand. And so I've been watching a lot of Marvel movies, Star Wars, things like that on Disney Plus. So now back to the earlier question. How do you do any of this if you don't understand any of the language, at least at the start? And this is where, thank goodness, there have been lots of tools and technology that have come out that have made this process a lot easier. The first one I will mention is one called Language Reactor. And so Language Reactor is this plugin that you can put onto Google Chrome, and it basically allows you to take any video that you find on YouTube or Netflix, and you can overlay subtitles. And you can actually overlay 2 different rows of subtitles. You can have one row in the language that you're learning, in my instance, Chinese. And then you can have another row in the language that you already know, which in my instance is English. So that's one cool feature because you can start to match up the Chinese words with the English words when you're first starting out. And it has all this other cool stuff in it. Like you can hover over different characters and it'll pop up the meaning. You can color code characters based on whether you know them or not. And so this alone was enough so that even when I knew 0 Chinese, I could start watching stuff and I could start making at least some sense of it. Now, the other big tool that I use is one called Link. And this provides a lot of similar stuff to Language Reactor, but this one is focused more on reading. And so you can input books, articles, movie scripts. You can import these all into Link and it gives you the same ability to kind of color code different words based on how well you know them, to hover over words to see the meaning. And similarly with this, it's still slow and painful at the beginning, but you can at least start to make some progress. Now, again, this is something that I could talk about for ages. And instead of doing that, I would just link some more information in the description below. So there's all these tools out there that can help you, but there's still one mindset thing that you have to really get into place before this method can work. You just need to accept a couple of things. You need to accept that it's gonna be slow. You need to accept that you're not gonna understand everything, at least at the beginning. And that second one can be especially hard because as adults, we're not used to doing things where we're pretty much incompetent at the start. This is something I realized just recently when I was learning to ski a couple years ago as an adult. I think a lot of people get turned off from these types of things because they don't want to go back to being a beginner. But if you can get over that hump, then methods like this can work and you can make a lot of progress. Okay, and then there's another question, which is how you actually go through this content. There's 2 major camps. The first camp says that you should kind of go through it very slowly, and you should be looking up or hovering over every word that you come across, and you should make sure you understand everything of the content that you're trying to consume. The second camp is more on the opposite, where they would just say, actually, you should not focus on any of that. You should just kind of read or watch things at normal speed and just pick up what you can along the way, but don't worry about understanding everything. Take more of a mass immersion approach where you're just injecting a lot of the language into your head, and eventually you will understand. And as for me, I've taken a bit of a mix. I basically do both of these things. Because I think the first version we were going more slowly. It helps you really digest what the sentence is. It helps you learn new words. And the second approach of just going through things quickly, I think that helps with just overall kind of mass input and seeing things over and over and over again. All right, so that is input. And this is a huge topic. So if you have questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'm happy to make follow-up videos on this topic alone. But for now, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to go to point number 4, which is grammar. And honestly, I haven't focused much on this one, because as I mentioned earlier, if you're following this more input-based approach, the recommendation is that you don't need to focus that much on this, because the idea is that you will just absorb what the grammar is as you are doing your input. But most people recommend that, yes, you should focus on it somewhat, but the point is essentially to learn some of the basics of the grammar with the sole focus of then being able to understand your input better. Because if you know some of the basic grammatical constructions, the input that you're consuming can make a lot more sense. And so I found a couple of good grammar resources online, and I also bought a physical book. Again, I'll link to those in the description below. Okay, and then finally, you have output. And again, this is the one that I've focused the least on so far, but I am doing a little bit. Like for instance, I have some Anki flashcards where on the front of the card, I have a recording of a sentence, and on the back of the card, I have, what that sentence actually says in Chinese characters. And sometimes I'll try to repeat those sentences in the same way that the person and the recording said it. So basically playing a little bit of repeat after me. But really, aside from that, I'm not doing much. And my thought is that once I get a little bit farther into this, that is when I will ramp up the focus on output. All right, first deep dive is into how I am collecting input and consuming it. And I gotta say I have a bit of a system. The first part I wanna go over is the input itself and where I'm actually getting that from. As I mentioned earlier, one of the places I'm getting my input from is Disney Plus, which happens to have almost all of its shows and movies actually dubbed in Chinese and many other languages. And most of those shows have not only dubbing, but also subtitles. So I've been starting kind of largely with content that I already know and that I've already seen in English, such as Star Wars and Marvel. And then Netflix is another place that sometimes has content that is also dubbed in Chinese and subtitled in Chinese, though it is much less of a selection than Disney Plus. But there are still a couple shows there that I watch, and one has been Arcane, which I highly recommend. And then I have also been following some creators on YouTube, and they are people who are mostly making videos about fitness or cooking or movies and TV. One of the great things about Chinese is that almost all content created by kind of native Chinese people has subtitles on it. So pretty much any video that you go to on YouTube is gonna have those subtitles, which is really great. Now, when I'm watching this stuff, I'm not always watching it on those specific services. So I'm not like always going to Disney Plus and watching it straight from their app. Instead, for a lot of this, I pulled this onto my own media server using the service called Plex. There are a few reasons that I do this, but the main one is that it just makes everything a bit easier to keep track of. And it also allows me to add customized subtitles files. And I'll talk more about why I need to do that in a minute. But first, I want to show you what it actually looks like. So here is my Plex server. And you can see it's all kind of displayed in this nice format where you have these nice movie posters, you have this progress bar here, you have the titles, and then I have all these sections over here on the left. The first one is movies. So you can see I have all of these movies here. I have some of the Avatar movies, start building out the Star Wars movies, and then some of the Marvel movies as well, and then a couple of Disney movies. Disney is pretty good because the language is a bit simpler, and I've seen a lot of these already, so it's a bit easier to understand. And then I have TV shows as well. As I mentioned, Arcane, started watching Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Expanse, Star Wars Clone Wars, and Andor. And then for each of these, you can kind of click in. You can go to the first season. You can click into a specific episode, and then you see all this nice information about everything. You can choose your subtitles files. So it's really nice. I really love this. It has all my stuff here in one place. And one of the other really good things is that you can use this cross-device. So I'm using this here on my desktop, but you can also use it on your phone, on your iPad, and it keeps everything synchronized so that you can pick up right where you left off. Now, as I hinted before, there is one minor complexity with subtitles. There's a bit of an oddity with what's out there online for a lot of things, and that is that often the subtitles will not match the dubbing. So it's like the dubbing will be saying one thing and then the subtitles will be saying an entirely different thing. And the reason for this, or at least what I've heard, is that it's often different translation teams that are doing the subtitles versus the dubbing. And they do this because they're actually optimizing for different things. For instance, the teams that are translating it for subtitles are usually optimizing to make sure that you can kind of read everything easily in a short period of time. So they'll be trying to make sure that the subtitles aren't going by too fast, that there aren't too many words on the screen at the same time. And so that leads to kind of one type of translation, maybe shorter sentences, maybe less verbose. But then the people who are translating it for the dubbing don't really care about that. What they care about is trying to make it so that the language somewhat matches the lip movements. And of course, it's impossible to get it to fully match, but you can do better or worse depending on how you translate it. So that is all great when you have native speakers who are trying to use the subtitles or dubbing just to understand what it is they're watching. But it's not great for people who are trying to use this content for language learning, because if the subtitles are saying one thing and the dubbing is saying another, it just makes it so that you have to process more. Now, luckily there are some AI tools out there that will help you solve this problem. And they do this by taking in a sound file and then allowing you to create subtitles that are basically based on the dialogue in that sound file. The one that I use is one called Subs AI, which is based on a model produced by OpenAI. And it's not 100% accurate either. There's sometimes mistakes, but I'll say that those tools are pretty good and they are certainly better than nothing. So that gets to why I'm using Plex, because usually I want to use my own subtitles file that I know matches the sound at least as good as I can get it. And then one other modification that I make to the subtitles files is, you know, when you're usually watching something, it's like they'll say something and then the subtitle will come up just for while they're saying it, and then it'll go away once they're done saying that statement. So I've modified most of my subtitles so that the subtitles stay on the screen even after the person is done speaking. And that gives you just a little bit more time to actually read and process the language than you would have otherwise. Now, I have to say it's quite a bit of work to get this all into this Plex system, and there's actually more steps than what I even just went through. I'm using quite a few tools and even some coding in the process. But if you want to know more, leave a comment and maybe I can make a video specifically on that topic. Okay, so that's how I get the input, and the next thing I want to go over is how I actually consume the input. Now, for a given piece of content, I usually actually take it in several different stages. Now, take a movie like Thor, which is one that I'm watching right now. The first stage is that I will usually just watch it kind of full speed, no pausing. I'll have the subtitles on in Chinese, and I will just see what I can get just watching it that way. And a lot of times, given I'm still pretty early in my learning, I'm not getting much. But if it's a movie that I've seen before already, then I usually know what's going on at almost every part of the movie, and sometimes I even know exactly what they're saying. And so I can pick quite a bit up. Now, one of the language learning platforms that I follow called Refold, they would call this stage free flow, because it's just kind of flowing into your mind. So that's the first stage. And then the second stage is what I would call more intensive phase. And so for this stage, I will watch it again, but I will make sure that I'm reading every single subtitle, and I will be trying my best to understand what every single subtitle says. And that might include looking up a lot of words. So that's the second stage. And then the third stage I usually take is more of what I would call a passive stage. And for that, basically all I do is I take just the audio only and I make a mini podcast out of it. And then I upload it to my podcast app of choice, which is for me, Overcast.fm. And so that way I can listen to it just when I'm doing kind of anything, walking around, shopping, exercising. And so that's why I call it passive, is because usually I'm doing something else while I'm also listening to the language. Now, I don't always go through all of those stages in that exact order, but that's generally how I am trying to consume most of my input. Now, there are some tools that I'm also using to enable this entire process. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of tools that allow you to make much better use of your subtitles. And they do things like give you the ability to hover over different words to see what the definitions are, and then also color code based on whether you know the word or not. All right, so the first tool that I'll mention is one called Language Reactor. So here I have Avengers Infinity War fired up, and there are a few things that you can do with this tool. The first is that you can layer on subtitles, and it can actually be in a couple different languages. So right now I have it in Chinese, but when I hover over, it'll also layer in the English. And then you can hover over words to see the definitions and also the pronunciations. And then you'll also see this color coding. And basically the way this works is that white are words that I know already, and then you'll see some other colors. Yellow are words that I don't know yet, but that the Language Reactor platform thinks are pretty common, and so I should consider learning those next. The purple are ones that I also don't know yet, but these are ones that the Language Reactor platform thinks are pretty rare, and so they would say, don't worry about learning those words yet. And then if I come across a set of yellow words or purple words that I want to learn, then I can also click this button and it puts a yellow border around it. And so that way, if that word comes up again later, it'll be a little bit easier to recognize that, hey, that's a word that I'm trying to learn, and I can pay special attention to it. And then there's another option you can do, which is to basically show pinyin over certain words. You can show them over all words, or in this case, I just have them shown over some of the words that I don't actually know yet. But I usually have this turned off. Now, the second tool that I'll mention is one called Link. Now here's what this looks like, and it actually provides a lot of similar features to what Language Reactor does, but this one is more for kind of written materials, though it does give you the option to listen to sound as well. And what I'll do pretty often is actually import raw subtitles files, and then you go into the interface, and as I mentioned, it kind of provides a similar type set of features to what Language Reactor does, except for this is for text. So you have coloring, like Language Reactor. White means these are all words that I theoretically know. Blue are words that I've never come across before. So, you know, this one here I've never seen before. But then the yellow ones, there's actually different shades of yellow depending on how well you know them. And basically the yellow ones are ones that you've seen before. One difference between this one and Language Reactor is that you can kind of assign different levels of how well you know something. And actually the way it works is that there is a 1 to 4 scale. So if you click on any word, you can see that you can assign sort of this 1 to 4 scale, and then there's kind of a number 5 as well, which is that you just kind of fully know the word. And I really like this numbering system because it gives you some ability to actually differentiate between just how well you know everything. So when it comes to consuming input in my more intensive pass, I've experimented with a few different ways of doing it, but the way that I've landed on doing it at the moment is that I actually use both Plex as well as Link at the same time. And so what I'll do is I'll bring up a couple of different windows. On my left, I have Link, and I have
the subtitles file in kind of written form here. And then on the right, I'll have the video playing in Plex. And so what I'll do is I will go to this page, I'll read all of the lines on the page, and if there's words that I don't know, such as this one, I've never seen that one before, but I'll click on it. It goes from blue to yellow, signifying that now I've seen it before. And I'll go through that and I'll read each one, and then I will basically go through and play. After I've read and understood what it's saying, I'll go through and play the sound.
汽人演到矛盾了吗？没矛盾，它不是机器人，它有生命。那现在谁能找到它？
And so I'll just go through the whole movie or video like that, and I'll hopefully understand most of it. All right, and then the third part of my system is how I keep track of this all. How do I keep track of all the input I'm consuming, what stage I've consumed it at, all of that stuff. And for that, I have this pretty massive database in Notion. If you don't know what Notion is, it's basically a note-taking app on steroids. Now, I could make an entire video, probably more than one video just on Notion, but I won't do that here. So if you have questions or want to see more, let me know in the comments below and I'm happy to make another video about it. So basically what I have is this big database that has entries for every single piece of input that I am in the process of consuming. So you can scroll, scroll, scroll and see kind of all of the different stuff that is somewhere in the process. So for each piece of media here, I usually collect a few different things. The first is the name, which you see here on the cover. You can click into it. You can see all this other information about it. You can see some basic stats such as the length, the number of words. And you can also see here, of all the words in this piece of media, what percent do I actually know? And so for this number of words and then for this percent known, I'll get to how I actually collect that information here in a bit. But then I also collect what stage of the process it's in. As I mentioned, I have a few different stages. The first is kind of free flow, which is where I'll just watch something and I won't pause. I'll just watch it at normal speed. Second is intensive, where I will, again, look up every word that I don't know. And then last is sort of a passive or free flow stage where maybe I'll listen to it or maybe I'll watch it on free flow kind of repeatedly after I've already kind of figured out what everything is. And then I will list out some basic stats for how many times I've consumed the media in different styles. For this one, let me go to another one, which is Avatar: The Way of Water, which I've watched kind of free flow style once. I've done it intensive once through Link, so that means that I looked up every word. And then I've listened to it on kind of passive audio through my podcast app 3 times. And this is one of the first movies that I've watched in Chinese, and so I'm getting to know this one pretty well. And then I have some other information here. This all has to do with just, it's different stage of processing the input so that I can get it into Plex. And then I have some stuff down here that calculates how many hours I've spent in different stages, and these are calculations based on some of the information above. And then what you have here on this dashboard is you have all the media that I am currently consuming in an intensive fashion. Most of this is in Link right now, and I'm slowly going through the subtitles word by word for each of these. These are ones that are on deck for that treatment next. These are ones I've already watched, more in a free flow fashion, but now I want to read them in a more intensive fashion. And then these are things that I've basically loaded into Plex, but I haven't watched them at all yet. And then if I go to this tab, this is all of the stuff that I've actually kind of finish all of the stages of. And so you notice here that there's this kids cartoon. This is one on YouTube made for Chinese kids. Each episode's about 12 minutes long. And it's not something that most adults would be interested in. It's basically about a bunch of little sheep and some wolves and some of their adventures. And the plot of each episode is not super complicated, but it is a little bit entertaining and interesting, especially more in the language learning context, because often I can understand more of this than I can understand of other stuff, which inherently just makes it a little bit more interesting. And the good thing about these is that they also exaggerate everything. So they exaggerate all of the actions, all of the visuals, and they repeat words a lot. So for the words that I do learn through this particular cartoon, they tend to stick in my mind a little bit better because I have a very clear visual representation of what happened in the cartoon when I learned that word. And again, they repeated the word a lot probably in that episode, which means that it just sticks in my memory a little bit better. All right, I want to show you one other thing that I have been doing on the input front, and that is creating my own custom graded readers. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, graded readers are basically books that have been written in simplified language. In Chinese, often it means that these books are using a very small subset of characters, and they are written that way so that they will be easier for a learner to understand. Here's an example of one. And, these can be pretty good and pretty useful. The issue is that
they are often just not very interesting. Like, they are written on stories that maybe were already in English in a more complicated form and like rewritten and simplified Chinese, but most of these are frankly stories I'm not interested in reading. So it's like, what do you do? Well, you can read native level books, and here's an example of one of them. This is the first book of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone in Chinese. And it's like, yeah, you can go this direction as well, but this is very hard. Like, there's very complicated language in here. If you've read a book in English, you know that authors often use very flowery language, all these unnecessary words, and it just makes it harder to understand if you are a foreign language learner. So what would be great is if you could get the simplicity of something like this graded reader, along with having something more interesting like this native level version of Harry Potter. And so I think I have found a solution, or at least we're gonna see. And so basically I created my own graded reader version of the first Harry Potter book. And here you can see it here, Harry Potter, Yu Mo Fa Shi. And you can see it's actually like a full hardcover book, and there's like actual pages, right? So you might wonder, how did I create this? So what I basically did was I took, this original book, and I found a text version of it online, and then I took each chapter of this book and I ran it through ChatGPT. And for each chapter, I basically asked ChatGPT, hey, can you simplify this? Can you shorten this? Can you use simpler language, simpler sentences? And it took a lot of trial and error, but I got a version that is probably 25 to 30% of the length of the original version, using words that I am a lot more likely to know. There's still a lot of new words in here as well, but it's a lot more likely that I'm gonna know the words in this version. And so this is just a lot better. And I took the next step and I actually bound it into a hardcover bound book using at-home bookbinding techniques, which I didn't even know that you could do at home before I looked into it. That's its own rabbit hole that you could go down. The other thing I did was I created this kind of side reference. And what this is a list of the words from this book that I don't already know yet. And so what it is it goes chapter by chapter, and there's basically for each chapter, there is a table of words from that chapter that I don't know. In each table there's the Chinese word, there's the pinyin, and there's a definition as well. You may ask how I created this, and this is a combination between another tool that I have where you can kind of put in text and then put in a list of words that you already know, and then it'll spit out all these lists of words that you don't know, kind of in order of appearance. And then I basically took the output of that tool, that list of words, and I put it into ChatGPT, and I said, hey, take this list of words, can you return to me a table that has each of these words along with this definition? And this was the output. So what I can basically do is I can have this book and be kind of reading it, and then every time I get to a word that I don't know, I can look in this book and look up the definition and then go back to this book and then kind of go back and forth and back and forth. And it is a little bit slower than if I was reading something in English, but it is way faster than if I was just trying to read this version of the book without any aids, or maybe if I was reading this version of the book and going through and looking up each word each time I didn't understand it. And so I'm about halfway through this first book, and so far the experience has been great. I'm gonna see how I feel at the end of this book and then decide whether I'm going to make other books like this, because they are a lot of work, but I think it's pretty rewarding. And just one thing I'll say is, I have a lot of other digital stuff that I use, but it is nice to have a physical, real life thing that I am also using alongside all of those digital things. It's just another way to interact with the language, and I think that once I actually finish this, it'll feel like I've read a real book, even though it's simplified, and I'm sure that will bring its own sense of accomplishment. Okay, now in the second deep dive, I want to show you how I am learning vocabulary, and particularly how I am using flashcards and spaced repetition, or SRS. Now, the first question is, where do I get the words from? Like, how do I decide which words to learn next? And it's like, ideally you would want to start with some of the most common words, and then slowly make your way to words that are rarer and rarer. And they do have some lists out there that basically rank order like words by decreasing frequency. And that can be a pretty good starting point, but I will say that these word lists tend to be pretty different depending on the source that you get it from. And so I use a little bit of those types of lists at the beginning, but then I gradually evolve my approach so that I am now basically sourcing all of my words from the input that I am consuming, meaning that I am waiting until I encounter certain words kind of over and over again in the movies and the TV shows and whatnot that I am looking at. And only then do I decide like, okay, I'm gonna really try to commit and learn this particular word. Okay, so that's where I get the words from. And then the second question is, once I get those words, how do I actually learn them? Well, for that, I have a bit of a system like I do for everything else you've seen in this video. Now, the first step is really just for me to kind of log the different words that I am seeing coming up over and over again. And for this, I have really been using this program called Link, which I've talked about a few times. And then I also have a word tracker in Notion. So let me show you how this works. So if I open up Link and I go to vocabulary, they have this area here where you can keep track of different vocabulary that you're learning. And again, it's on a 1 to 5 scale. And so what I do is, as I'm kind of consuming content, I'm just moving these numbers up from 1 to 4 to 5, depending on how well I think I know each word every time it comes up. And so my main goal in Link is getting words up to score number 4, which I use to say that I know it pretty well. Like, I recognize it when it comes up, but I know that I don't know it fully. Like, I might not know the characters fully yet, but I'm pretty sure I would recognize that word in context most times when it came up. And so when I get it up to this 4 level, then I add it to this database that I have in Notion. And let me show you that. That is here, and it's this word tracker. And basically all I have is this is like a big database where it's organized by day. So this is today, May 27, 2024. And I have May 26th and May 20th. It's basically a long list of days. And then for each day, I'm keeping track of different words that I'm learning or different words that I'm doing different things to. And so if it has this little tag of an arrow and a 4, that means that that is the day that I transition that word from some earlier score to a score of 4 in Link. So again, this means that at this point, I think I would recognize this mostly when it came up in context, and I'm starting to like know this word, you know, fairly well. Okay, so that is the first couple stages of learning a word. I get it up to this score of 4 in Link, and then I record it on a list. Stage 2 is that I like to then really cement that word in my mind. And for me, what that means is making flashcards out of it using spaced repetition, or SRS. And again, the program of choice for me here is called Skritter. Now, it's really interesting because I don't even know if I would do this step for other languages, because the first stage of like waiting for, you know, the numbers to increase on the words and to get it to level 4, that has allowed me to understand words pretty well. But the main reason I am still making flashcards out of all of these words, or there's 2 reasons. Number 1, I think that it does help cement the words better in your mind. Like, and it helps me be a lot more confident that I know the words. And the second is because, and this is unique to Chinese, I am learning to write all of the characters and all of the words. And Skritter allows you to write out the words and write out the characters. And so for that, I think it's worth it. Otherwise, I'm not sure if I would do this part. But anyway, the way that I do this is, like I said, I wait until words get to this level of 4 in Link, which means I already know the definition pretty well. And then what I do is I go into Link, I basically filter it down to just the words that have a score of 4, and I hit apply. And this is now the list of words, and this is 783 words here that have this score of 4 or more, or really just this score of 4, but that I have not made flashcards for yet. And then I'm just kind of working my way through this list and creating flashcards based on this list. The other thing I do take into account is whether I know the characters in a given word or not. Like, all else being equal, I like to learn the words that I already know all the characters for first, because those are a bit easier. If I have to learn 1 or more characters, that just makes it take longer to learn the word. And so the other thing I can do is I'm usually tagging these words with whether I know the characters or not. So there's a tag here I have for whether I know the characters, and I can apply that filter. Now, this is the list of words that are both score of 4 and where I also know all the characters. And so this is 14 different words, a much kind of smaller number of words. But there have been times where I really start with this list in my flashcard program because these are a bit easier to learn. So I'm taking words from Link. Again, these are words that I already know pretty well, and then I'm putting them into Skritter. So let's open up Skritter. I have a few different types of lists here that I'm learning from, but just as an example, first I'll start with a word where I know all the characters, but I haven't made a flashcard on it yet. 上学, go to school. So how this works is you go into the word, there's all this information here, and you can click Learn Now, And once I go through this, it'll actually create the series of flashcards and put it into my queue to study later on. But there's this first learning step. You go teach me. It's basically going to show me a version of each of these flashcards kind of as an initial learning. So what's the definition? 上学. So I know that, again, that is to go to school. Okay. And then the next type of card is show you the definition, what its opinion. And I know it's a 上学. Okay.
上学.
Okay. And it also says it out loud. Okay. So the third type of card is tell what the tone is given the pinyin. And I know that this is the fourth tone, and this is the second tone.
上学.
上学. Okay.
上学.
And then here is writing it. And it's going to give a few different stages. The first stage it has is where it's guiding you along the way. Okay. And then it's going to show you again, it's going to show the little silhouette, but it's not going to tell you the stroke order. So this is like, I have to remember the stroke order. Okay. And luckily, kind of know these characters already, so it's fine. And then the third version of this, and this is the version I actually get when I'm reviewing flashcards in the future, is without any help at all. And so I have to just remember what it is. So it's like shang shui. Okay, and like my handwriting is usually like pretty crappy, but if it's within sort of reasonable bounds, it'll usually count as correct. And then otherwise, it won't count it as correct. Okay, so that's for a word where I already know the characters. But let's say that there's a word where I don't know all the characters already. So let me show you an example of that from a different list. This is a word, zuo. I don't know this character yet. This is not a character that I've learned. So the process for learning a word like this is almost the same as what I just showed you. Like if I hit this Learn Now button, it's gonna take me through the same series of steps. The only thing different with this type of word is that before I hit the Learn Now button, I will create a mnemonic device. And you can see that there's a section here for mnemonic. And this is one that someone has already created. Like there's some user-generated ones you can just like choose from. Usually I don't like these at all, and I usually make up my own. And the way you can do this is you can go click this edit button, and then it lets you kind of like go in and write your own thing here, and then it'll save it. And again, the way that I'm usually doing this is I'm using this memory palaces method that I've mentioned before in the video, and again, which I will put a link in the description below for. And this is just a system for creating mnemonic devices that incorporate, again, the character, the meaning, the pinyin, and the tones all in one. And so I'll just create that mnemonic device, I will have it there, and then I will kind of click the Learn Now and go through the same system. That is how I have learned the vast majority of words in Chinese. And I have to say, it has felt fun, like especially using Skritter, it kind of feels like a fun game at some points. It's also annoying at some points, but often it's like a fun game. Final deep dive, I think, which is going to be on output. As I've mentioned a few times, I have not really focused on output that much this year, but lately the main new tool that I've added to the toolbox is ChatGPT, which has helped me start at least doing some output. And really what I've done is I've created a few custom GPTs to help me with different kind of language learning tasks. Now, if you want more detail on how I created any of these, let me know. I'm happy to make a video about it. But the one thing I'll say is that they were actually pretty easy to create. I would say much easier than what I expected. All right, so first, before we even get to any of the GPTs that are focused on output, there is one that is not output based, but I will still show you right now. And that is one that I call Chinese Word Helper. So what is Chinese Word Helper? It is basically a dictionary or a translator on steroids. There's a few things that you can do with it. The first is that you can just put in one single word and it'll give you a definition. So let me try to do that right now. I'll put in the word zheng, shui. And this one means correct or right in English. And what it does is it gives me the pinyin, it gives me a definition, and then it gives me a few sample sentences. Now, the second thing I can do with it is give it 2 or more different words that are maybe similar in meaning, but that I, as a learner, don't really know how or if they're different. And if I do that, it will give me an explanation of what are the differences between those 2 words. So as an example, I'm just going to put in a few different variations of the word in Chinese that means can or be able to. So one is 可以. Another one is nung. And then another one is, what is the third one? Oh, it's hui. No, not that one. That one.
Okay. Okay, so it says these three words, 可以, 能, and 会, can all be translated to can or able to in English, but they each have distinct nuances and uses. So it says 可以. It can be translated to can or may or be allowed to, but it's usually used more as like an expression of permission or possibility. And it gives you a couple of sample sentences. And then 能 is really used to express ability or capability or possibility due to circumstances. And the third one is 会, which is usually used to express learned ability or future possibility. And then it gives a summary of the differences here below. And so I think this is a pretty good explanation. Like, based on my experience, realistically, these words are somewhat interchangeable in some circumstances in Chinese. But this is pretty close to the explanation that I got on Reddit when I looked it up and saw native Mandarin speakers explaining how these are used differently. And so I'm gonna say that this is pretty good. And then finally, the third thing that I can do is just put in a sentence and it will translate it. So I'm gonna try this one, Yuan Li. Wei Yu Ni Tong Zai. Which translates as, may the force be with you, from Star Wars. So you might ask, like, why would you use ChatGPT for this, especially the dictionary one where you could just use a dictionary? Well, I have found that, especially when you're trying to understand the different nuances between very similar words, ChatGPT typically provides much clearer and more useful explanations than what you can find in a dictionary. And I have to say, at first I was worried about accuracy, like, is it gonna make mistakes? Is it gonna hallucinate? And then am I gonna learn a lot of wrong things? But I'm not too worried about that anymore because I've shown this to a few native friends and they say that the results are pretty good. And realistically, I think that some of these responses are so helpful that even if they're not 100% accurate, the good vastly outweighs the bad. Like, there are entire sentences that, like, I tried to look up a word that I found in the dictionary and I still couldn't understand what the sentence meant. But then when I put it into ChatGPT, it's like, oh my God, okay, I can actually understand what this word means in this context now, and the dictionary was not able to help me with that. Okay, so that's the first thing, Chinese word helper, basically dictionary on steroids. So the second one is one called Chinese text corrector, and this does exactly what it sounds like. It basically lets me put in a sentence or more in Chinese, and it will tell me what it thinks the corrections should be. And then I also ask it to give me an assessment of just like how natural in general what I'm writing is sounding like. And so I'm gonna, as an example, put in a sentence that I know has a couple of errors and see what it says. So what I'm gonna try to say is, yesterday I watched a movie. So 今天我看到电影. Okay, let's see what it says. So it says, overall, the sentence is mostly understandable, but it contains a minor grammatical issue that makes it sound slightly unnatural. And it says the verb 看到 should be 看了 to correctly indicate the completion of the action. And so the issue here is that what I wrote is not really in the past tense. Like, Chinese doesn't really have tenses, it has something different called aspects, but from what I wrote, it's not clear that I already finished watching the movie, so you need the little le in there. And then the other thing that I think this is getting at is I should not say 看到. I should just say 看 if I'm saying for like watching movies. 看到 is something else, at least as far as my rudimentary understanding of Chinese, and so it's also correcting that. So again, this may not be 100% correct, and particularly my guess is that sometimes I write things that have errors in it, and it may not catch all the errors. And then sometimes it also says, like, you should do something different even if the original version of what I wrote is fine. Like, I've showed that to native speakers a couple times, and it's like, ChatGPT is saying that this sounds slightly unnatural, but my native friend is saying, like, actually what you said is fine. So again, it's not perfect, but what I'm using it for is hopefully to help me correct the major, like, glaring grammatical errors. Like, I think it's pretty good on that. Okay, and then the third one is one that I call Mandarin Buddy. And basically this is a chat buddy. And the way this works is that I will put in a sentence to start the chat, and then
it'll respond with a few different things. First, it'll tell me any errors that I had in the sentence that I just wrote. And then second, it'll give its response. And then third, it will define any words that I don't already know. And this is based on a list of words that I've uploaded into ChatGPT of all of the words that I know up to that point. Okay, so for this, I'm gonna start a conversation. So if we're talking about movies, I'll try to say, what is your favorite movie? And I'm making this up on the spot, so I don't know if this is correct or not, but I'll say, 你更喜欢哪个电影？哪个电影？你更喜欢哪个电影？ Let's see what it comes back to me with. And here it says, your sentence is correct, but it can be slightly improved for clarity. The corrected version is, 你最喜欢. Okay, 最 is better. 喜欢哪部电影? And so I know that I put 个, and I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be 部, so that makes sense. And then it gives this response, and it says, 我最喜欢的电影是卧虎藏龙 Nina. Okay, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, I didn't know that. And how about you? And I can say, and this is great because now I know I'm supposed to use Zui instead of Gung. And I think I knew that somewhere in my mind, but I had forgotten. And maybe Gung is also right, but Zui, I'm pretty sure is better. So I can also say, 我最喜欢 and I don't remember how to say this in Mandarin, but I can say in English, Lord of the Rings. And let's see what it says, because sometimes if I put something in English, it'll also kind of correct me and say, like, here's what it would actually be in Mandarin. Okay, and that's exactly what it says. It says, your sentence is correct, however, for consistency, you might want to translate the title into Chinese or use quotation marks. And then it gives me a response, and it says, 我也很喜欢这碗王. And I don't know if that's the normal way of saying Lord of the Rings. Like, I've heard it differently, but okay, we'll go with that. And then it says, 你最喜欢里面的那个角色. And so it's like, what character do you like the most? And this is useful because 角色 is not a word that I know. This means character. But it's saying down here that it's giving me the definition of that word. And so now it's like, okay, I'm learning that word. It's giving me the explanation. It's pretty great. But it's not perfect. So like, for instance, this word, yeah, I know that word. And so I don't know why it's pointing out that I don't know that word, but I know that word. So anyway, that's that. And so this is good because I can at least do some basic practice at kind of chatting back and forth, and hopefully ChatGPT is correcting at least the most glaring errors that I'm making, and I'm learning some new vocabulary along the way. Okay, and then the last thing that I use ChatGPT for sometimes is actually a technique called shadowing, and this is something that if you are in the language learning community, you may have heard of, but this is basically you have a native speaker, or in this case, kind of an AI speaker, say something out loud, and then you try to repeat after them using the same intonation and everything as they are using. And so you can do this with ChatGPT with their text-to-speech. If you've seen it in English, especially some of the recent versions, you can see that it sounds pretty natural. I haven't been fully confident around how natural it sounds for Chinese, but again, I did show it to a couple of native speakers, and they say that actually the text-to-speech is like pretty good, and so I've used this. And so let me just go actually to an existing chat, and so this is a chat I was actually using to help practice some of the lines for the skit that I had at the beginning of this video. And basically all I do is this is me like writing out something in Chinese, and earlier in the chat, I just said, I'm going to paste a bunch of Chinese text here. When I do so, can you simply repeat it back to me with no other added content? And so basically it will then repeat it back here, and more importantly, there's this read aloud button that comes up so I can hear it, pronounce it. And so let me try it with this one actually.
为什么你还没吃饭？为什么你还没吃饭？
为什么你还没吃饭? Okay, so 为什么你还没吃饭? So I can go like
为什么你还没吃饭？
为什么你还没吃饭?
为什么你还没吃饭？
为什么你还没吃饭?
为什么你还没吃饭？
为什么你还没吃饭? Okay, so you get the idea. And again, this text-to-speech is probably not perfect, but I think that it gets most of the core pronunciation correct, particularly the tones. And sometimes the speech is a little garbled, but I can usually tell when it's like way off. And it's like, yes, this would be better if I was doing it with a native speaker, but this is frankly a lot easier. And I think it's probably good enough because it's gonna allow me to do better than I would if I was doing absolutely nothing and just trying to figure out pronunciation on my own without any help. Okay, so the final deep dive is how I am tracking progress. I'm about to show you some very detailed tracking on how I have spent my time and what my progress has been like. You might ask why I'm tracking this at all, because it's pretty detailed, and some might say that's not really necessary. But I personally find it very motivating and also really good for accountability. I really love popping up this dashboard that I'm about to show you every day and just seeing how far I've come. And I think this is really important for something like language learning where the progress is very, very, very slow. And it's so slow that it can be hard to know if you are actually making any progress at all. But because of what I'm about to show you, I know that I'm making at least some progress. Whether that will get me to fluency in any reasonable amount of time is a whole other topic, but at least I know I'm going in the right direction. Okay, so with that, let's get to my progress tracker. And there's a few sections here. The first is that there's a bit of a summary in these first few rows here. So you can see that I started studying on May 28, 2023, and today is May 27, 2024. So I'm almost exactly a year in. So this calculates the number of months I've studied. And then it also shows me the total time I've spent studying in some form. And so far this year, it's been 941 hours. Which is about 2.5 hours per day. And if you're curious, I'm using an app called Toggle to track this pretty easily. And a little bit later, I will show you exactly how this breaks down into different types of activities. And I will also say that a lot of this 2.5 hours is concentrated into the weekends, which is when I typically have more time. Now, my initial goal is to get to that Foreign Services Institute estimate of around 2,200 hours to learn Chinese. Though I think it could realistically take a lot longer. Like I've heard estimates of more like 4,000, 5,000 hours. So we'll see how this goes, but I think once I get to about 2,000, it'll be a good time to pull up and see how I'm doing. All right, and then I have a bunch of stuff around characters and words. So first is the number of characters that I know, which is 728. And the way I'm counting this is if I have made a flashcard in that program Skritter, which I showed you earlier. And then I have this other thing called Skritter words. And so these are the words that I have put into Skritter, so that means that I've made flashcards on them. And these are the ones that I think I know pretty well. And just as a way of measuring that, when I look at my stats in Skritter, I'm usually getting these cards correct 85%, 90% of the time. So why is this number of 1922 different from the characters of 728? Well, that is because in Chinese, words are usually made up of more than one character. In fact, most words are composed of 2 characters. There are some that are just 1 character, there are some that are 3 or more characters, but the majority are words with 2 characters. And so 1922 is the number of 2 or more character words and also some 1 character words that I've been able to make using just the 728 characters that I already know. All right, and then I get to this idea of partially known words. So Skritter plus partial known words, which is 2,700. And then I have here that there are 778 of those that I partially know. So 778 plus 1922 equals 2,700. So what's this idea of partial words? Well, these are words that I think I know somewhat, but not completely. And the way that I'm measuring this is whether I have moved it to a score of 4 within LingQ. Remember, there's a 1 to 5 scale within LingQ, so this is 4, which is I almost know it, but not quite. And these are also words that I have not yet added to Skritter, so I have not yet made flashcards on them. And so yeah, this includes words where usually if I heard it or if I saw it written out in pinyin, especially if it's in context, I will probably be able to understand what it is. But I may not really know the character for it yet, or at least not consistently. I may not know the tones for it either. And if you take the word out of context, I may not be able to tell you what it means. So that is why it's partial. And I like at least keeping track of these words because knowing them at least partially does help me when I'm trying to understand something that I'm consuming. But the idea is to take these 778 words and eventually put them into Skritter so that they can become kind of fully known words. Another thing I'm tracking is the number of words read, which right now is about 250,000. And I'm really only counting this if I've read it in kind of intensive learning. So maybe it's like I'm reading a script on Link, or I'm reading a book chapter on Link, or maybe I'm reading a book outside of Link, like a physical book. And this is something that Link keeps track of words that you read, and then for stuff outside of Link, I just track it manually. And I've kind of set an arbitrary goal of getting to 1 million words here. I don't know what's gonna happen at 1 million words, but it sounded like a nice round number, so that's what I'm aiming for. Okay, and then finally I have this metric here of percent known, which is 79%. So what is this metric? So what this is I have taken basically a sample of the content that I consume, so the kind of movie subtitles, the book chapters, etc. And I've run that through a series of like analytics, kind of combined with the list of words from Skritter and the partially known words. And basically using those two things, I can figure out, okay, what percent of the words in the content that I'm consuming are words that I either know fully or know partially. And I'll talk more in detail in a bit about how I calculate this, but that's the basic idea. So random movie I watch, if it's kind of an average difficulty movie according to the content that I watch, I'm gonna know about 80% of the words in that movie. Now, importantly, this does not mean that I am able to understand 80% of the meaning, because that 20% tends to be pretty important and key words for understanding what the meaning is. And a lot of times you can guess, especially if you already know what's going on in the story. But if things are going fast enough and if you're having trouble really kind of taking it all in, this 80% might realistically mean 0% for some parts of what you're consuming. But I've still found this to be a pretty useful way for me to gauge progress because this number has gone up over time, which I'll show you in a little bit. And it also helps me kind of prioritize and triage what I'm consuming, because I can actually calculate this value for any specific TV show or movie or book that I might want to consume. And so when I know that I'm in the mood for choosing something easier, I can choose something that has a higher value on this. And if I want to challenge myself, I can choose something that has a lower value on this. So what is my goal on this metric? Well, I think my next goal is that I want to see what it feels like if I can get to 90% words known. And based on kind of the analysis I've done, I probably need to know somewhere around 5,000 words to realistically be there. So that's my next goal, 5,000 words. And then to reach like real fluency, my guess is that's more like 95% of kind of words known that you would need to get to, or maybe even more. And I think that's likely gonna take more like 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 total words known. So I still have a long way to go, but I'm still pretty happy with how things have gone so far. Okay, and so now the other thing is I am tracking a lot of this and more kind of detailed charts over time. So the first one that I'll show you here is the total hours per week. And the most important thing I want to show you is how I'm splitting this time up. Again, these are based on the time tracking app that I use called Toggl. These are based on different categories that you can create. All of the blue is different types of input. So again, intensive means that I am basically reading or listening word for word and making sure that I pretty much understand every single word. Free flow is more like I am watching something and not really looking any words up, or maybe reading something and not really looking any words up. And then passive means I'm usually really just kind of like listening to something. So this is where I've like made a podcast out of something that I've already consumed, and I'm just like listening to it while I am washing dishes or exercising or something like that. The yellow is vocab and SRS. So this is really kind of flashcards and related activities. And then the red one is language knowledge, and you'll see that this doesn't really appear that much throughout, but this includes things like grammar study, pronunciation study. This is me like learning things about the language. The next one here is output, and you'll see that this is purple, and this has really only started to appear in the last few weeks. And so this is my attempts to really start producing the language. That's either me trying to speak, or what I've spent most of my time here is really trying to write out things in Chinese. And then finally, this gray is uncategorized. And so all this is for the first several months that I was studying, I was not categorizing the type of
activity I was doing. I was just tracking overall, like how many hours am I spending on Chinese. Now, realistically, I do know that these first few months, this is almost all vocabulary study. Like there was some input, but this is really me making flashcards, really me trying to get up to the point where I learned about the first 1,000 words. And then there was also probably more grammar study in here as well than you see later in the year. So if I had to guess, this gray is probably like 80-90% vocabulary, maybe 10% language knowledge, maybe like another 5 to 10% of input. And I think the interesting thing to note here is that my focus has changed over time. Like I said, I've only recently started to do output. The dark blue, which is the intensive input, that particularly fluctuates up and down over time, really depending on how much brain power I have at any given time. And honestly, for a lot of these weeks, I really just tried to maximize the total number of hours I was spending on Chinese and didn't really fuss too much about how I was spending that time. And so you'll see a lot of it is the light blue, which is the kind of passive, where I'm maybe just like walking to work or exercising, listening to Chinese on my iPhone. All right, so let's scroll down. So this is the same thing, but just the number of hours per day. And you can see that this fluctuates wildly over time. But like I said before, this is on average 2.5 hours a day. And then I'm tracking the number of words I am learning each week. And this is based on the partially known words. So this is, I don't have to know the full kind of word for it to count here, but you can see that it fluctuates over time. Tracking the number of words read over time. And then I'm tracking the total number of words that I quote unquote know. And here the dark purple is the words that I fully know, which is the ones I've made flashcards on. And then the light purple is the ones that I partially know, as I had explained before. Okay, and then finally, the percent of words that I know in the content. And you can see that that has gone up over time. It went up really quickly at first, and now we're starting to reach a plateau, which kind of makes sense and is expected for language learning. But let me take this as a chance to give you a little bit more detail on what this number actually is and how I calculate it. So what this is I have taken kind of 10 standard pieces of content. So this is like 10 TV shows or YouTube videos or whatnot. And I basically run those 10 pieces of content through this program about once a month. And I bump that up against the words that I know at that time, because I have a list of that I keep. And then it spits out kind of a weighted average across those 10 pieces of content. What percent of words do I know? And if you're curious, the program that I'm using for this is called Chinese Text Analyzer, and I will leave a link to that somewhere in the description below. But it basically allows you to dump in any content and then a list of words that you know, and it will do all these calculations on how many total words do you know, how many unique words do you know, what percent of that is out of the document, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is a kind of deep dive chart here. And so, as I mentioned, there's these 10 pieces of content. This is a mix of movies and TV shows and YouTube videos and book chapters. And I am just basically using that program to calculate about every month what percent that I know. And then this row here is kind of the weighted average across those. And the only other thing I'll say is that there's a lot going on here, and because I also wanted to be able to take this information and then put it into my Notion database where I have kind of all these pieces of content. And I want to be able to have a field there where I can say like, okay, for a given piece of content, what percent of the words do I know at any given time? And to update that like every month would be like a lot, because this is across dozens and dozens of pieces of content. So long story short, I've written a bunch of scripts to automate a lot of this. So if anyone is interested to see the details of that, I am more than happy to share those. All right, so I'll go back here and I'll say, you know, again, this is a lot of things to track, but with me and my personality, I really love this kind of thing. And as I said earlier, it is giving me confidence that I am making at least some progress and heading in the right direction.
All right, well that is the video, and this is definitely the longest video I've ever made and the most complex video I've ever made. So I hope you got something good out of that, because it was a lot of work. But it has been a fun experience making this video, and it has also just been a really fun experience learning Chinese over this last year. I don't really know what the future holds, but for now, I'm gonna plan to keep learning, and so you may see some future updates from me. With that, if you like this video, give it a like, which will help others find it, and subscribe for more. Peace.